Hi, I'm Pranab Das. I'm the principal advisor for the Diverse Intelligences Initiative, and I'm a professor of physics at Elon University. When the organizers asked me to give this talk, I was really taken with the idea of big questions. Obviously, big questions have difficult answers, and in this case, I don't have an answer. So I'm going to ask a question that I'd like you to see more as a provocation, as an introduction to our conversations. And I'll look forward to being able to speak in person in early July when we all meet together for the Institute. My question begins with this problem of goals, what I think is a problem of goals. Most people who think about intelligences frame intelligences in terms of goals. So you will often have come across what you might think of as goal talk, and in a second I'll give you some examples of that. I just want to ask us to beware of that. I think goals are very useful. I think it's a tremendously powerful metaphor, but I do think that there are some deep underlying questions that we should ask. So the big question really is goal talk a good idea? And if so, in what contexts? So I want to give you some examples of goal talk. These are a few of our great contemporary thinkers, some of whom you'll hear from and others of whom I'm sure you know. A few of them, the first, Mike Levin. He's well known for a perspective that he calls intelligence all the way down. So he basically suggests that um, intelligences are nested, that organisms, their organs, the cells and cell structures that make them up, and even maybe the molecular structures that make up cells are themselves agential in a sense, that they might have goals that are unique to their spatiotemporal level. So things that happen quickly and things that happen over short range, for example, would be appropriate for cellular or subcellular mechanisms. But that they still, in a sense, are agents. They still proceed according to some problem-solving intelligence. Thomas Griffiths at Princeton, takes a similar approach, but he looks more at the categories of constraint, the characteristics of intelligences that make them better or worse at solving certain kinds of problems. Moreover, he would suggest that there are computational approaches that are innate to solving certain kinds of problems if you face certain kinds of constraints. So we as people have relatively small brain cases. We have to speak through this narrow communications tube that is language. And as a result, we are only well suited to computing toward certain problems, or computing solutions to certain problems. Jacob Foster, who's like I am, a kind of a complex systems emergentist person, supposes that there are maybe modular and perhaps composable ways of building temporary, momentary, fleeting responses to situations in the world, that the problems we solve can be solved by the agglomeration, by the compositionality of different modules, if you want, different self-organizing modules. But note in each of these quotations, there is a kind of an underlying flavor of a goal, a problem to be solved, a solution to be had. That's goal talk. And I think you'll find that it's almost ubiquitous in certainly in the first presentation most people give of intelligences. Now, happily, I think that most, if not all, really serious people are nuanced. And so what I want to do is I want to sort of eventually get us to those nuances and try to appreciate where the edges are between the usefulness of maybe naive goal talk and where nuance really begins to take a hand. So I had some alternate titles for this talk. Sorry. One was goals are for other people. This is kind of my personal perspective. I think you bumble around the world, you run into other agents who are bumbling around the world, and you try to make sense of them. Obviously, it's a great idea that was had before I had it by Daniel Dennett, and maybe that just infected me in my dreams. But his intentional stance essentially goes something like this: I see such an agent, I impute to them a goal, and then I measure their undertakings against that goal. Did they seem rationally to be proceeding toward that goal? Now, I think there's some interesting sort of downstream knock-on effects of this. One is that having built this whole sort of folk psychology of other agents who have goals, you could reflect upon yourself and say, ah, that's what I meant to do. That was my goal. So, in a sense, you can then impute to yourself goals that you might not otherwise have come to sort of organically. And then, secondly, and more trenchantly for the diverse intelligences undertaking, you could build machines and reify those goals into machines, like all machines are about solving problems. Um, Another way you could come at this whole question is sort of a Chomskyan one, is to say, I live in a enriched sort of psychological internal state, and bumbling around the world as I do, I've come to be able to express that to myself and others through language. What if there's something universal, as he would have said, about language that kind of channels us in certain directions? I want to, I need to, I have a feeling about all of these things. If language has those kinds of universals, might cause us to tend to think through the lens of a metaphor of causality, that rationalism always sort of adheres to the causal structure of language itself. So maybe goal talk is for other people, not for me. Um, and this is a silly reference to a lesser known Little Feat song, but the goals will steer you wrong sometimes. I think that's my claim, is that goal talk, for all of its strength, has some real perils. So I want to dive into those quickly. And again, this is just a very light skim off the top. And so we'll come back, I hope, in our conversations to many of these central ideas. All of you will know of the idea of utility, or the utility function. It's dominant in economics and behavioral economics and in cognitive science, but it often draws from a result from the 40s from von Neumann and Morgenstern that's about what the utility theorem. And it essentially goes something like this: certain kinds of agents uh, obeying certain kinds of rules in certain kinds of situations can always be described as maximizing some utility. There's some number that can be derived from a mathematical sort of structuring of their undertaking. It's a very powerful result, and unfortunately, it has often been taken in a sort of a naive way, without attention being paid to the certain kind issues. So you must have transitivity. That is, the thing you choose and another thing you choose must always live in some kind of a number line that you can go from one to the other and back again in a way that makes mathematical sense. And the other is another of the four really is independence. So because there's one option, it doesn't really change your relationship, your thinking about two options. But we know from the decoy effect, for example, that humans and animals don't work that way at all. When you put a third option out, suddenly the relationship between two options changes for you. So independence fails in many cases as well. But let's take the case that utility inheres. So for systems that obey a utility function, how does it work? Well, you're all familiar with the idea of gradient descent. So basically you say, how am I doing? You ask yourself right now. Then you act and you say, how am I doing now? And you compare those two. And the if it's better now than it was then, you stick with what you did. If it's worse, you go back to where you were before. Iterate that process, and eventually you make it down the hill. You find a bottom. So the metaphor, I mean, the very deep, I think, visceral response we have to that is that we all live in gravitational wells. We're always skiing downhill. Right? So we all know what it feels like to maximize something. It's upside down, maximize, minimize. It's the same story, right? All ski slopes lead down to the lodge. So there's this feeling that utility is a really good physical metaphor. It seems to capture something we've seen a lot in other places. But I want to remind you, those of you who took undergraduate physics, for example, that the notion of gradient descent, the notion of what we call minimal surfaces, is very particular. For just to start, you can't have anything but edge conditions. So for gradient descent to work, you can only have a single edge on one side and a single edge on another, maximum and minimum if you like. And here are some pretty edge conditions. There's sort of rubber sheets stretched on wires. But notice what they lack. There are no internal peaks, right? No thumbs pushing up through the rubber. There are no valleys. There are no holes. There are no tunnels. Um, Terrains like this, topographies like this are rare. They're mathematically well defined and quite rare. In fact, they don't really give you much in terms of a behavioral space. What you have to do to build a behavioral space out of these kinds of gradient descents is to structure something larger that kind of teases out local areas where gradient descent takes place and build something larger. And I'll show you that in a second, but just as a break, because I'm at the halfway point, maybe a little over, I always like to show at least one funny thing in each talk. So I'm putting both funny and, in my mind, really intense on this next slide. The intense one is a Calabi-Yau space, which is a very elaborate folded space. So it's a little bit like a Mobius strip. And I love those M.C. Escher engravings of ants walking around Mobius strips. Think about the ant as not maximizing an up and down, but maximizing a kind of a forwardness. So its utility is go forward, go forward, go forward. That ant succeeds, but always keeps coming around to the other side of the Mobius strip and then back to where it started. It never jumps off. So in string theory, the Calabi-Yau space is this compressed six-dimensional space that nothing in there can ever get out into our three-dimensional spaces. So there's a case in which you could be following some kind of utility around on a very complicated space and never get out. This is the funny is, like, what if M.C. Escher were designing, steel girders? Remember, the thing that Escher does is you can go up and up and up until you suddenly find yourself down again. That's a failure of transitivity that he can visually represent in those etchings, but is really ubiquitous in complex problem solving. So to sort of move to the second half of the talk, let's take the problems that arise then from this kind of utility function vision. You can have gradient descent, and it can be useful, especially if you construct a larger landscape out of gradients. So here's just a kind of a schematic. I think this is from some behavioral economics paper. But Kaufman's fitness landscapes, for example, and evolutionary biology fall into the same category. You might have a local peak and another peak and other peaks and valleys all over the place, each of which locally you can think of as climbing or descending based on gradient descent. But when you get to the top of some local peak, there you are. Right? There's no gradient descent that will get you across to the next peak over. So in evolutionary theory, that raises all sorts of interesting questions. Do you need catastrophes? Do you need saltations? What helps you get kicked out of sort of metaphorical landscape earthquakes, right? What helps you get out of these local minima? Furthermore, you can get like the Slough of Despond, just kind of a broad sea level where you just can't move, like nothing's better, nothing's worse, it's all meh. Then suddenly gradient descent doesn't do you any good at all, right? You could be anywhere at sea level and it would all be the same. So I just want to point out that even the most common uses we have of gradient descent for some of the really paradigmatic cases are all thinking locally, not necessarily globally. And so we need to sort of begin to ask how we do both. Just to remind you, we have, again, our experience of gravity is this Newtonian gravity, which is a linearization. It's a localization of curved Einstein spacetime, right? So we have this feeling that everything's linear, but in fact, there's much more going on. So how do you reconcile the problem of local action and global thought? So imagine you have a robot arm. Right? Robot arms, good ones, have lots of axes, 6 axes or something of rotation. There's a lot of different ways to sort of move this. I have no idea what this picture is. It's like a robot arm trying to serve its own innards to this very happy woman. But it wants to get that gear somehow to her. There are a couple of ways it can do that by thinking locally. So it can ask, am I closer at any given step? right? But in order to do that, obviously it has to have some kind of spatial probe, and there are some ambiguities, right? You could be in a number of different locations, each of which is equidistant, and you know one or the other might be better downstream for other movements it can make based on its the structure of its arm. It could take such a sort of hit or miss Brownian walk kind of thing through space and slowly approach based on some utility function, and then lock that in later, say that's the route I'm going to take, or it could even do that 100 times and choose the best one. So that's a kind of a thinking globally that requires memory. Or it could have a boss, right? She could be its boss, and she could be saying warmer, 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 colder, cold. Oh, you're cold. Yeah, that's it. The boss, the external agent, might then provide the information of some globality, if you want, to deal with the locality that arises naturally in the action of gradient descent. Another approach, another way this happens is the outside world. The outside world can just intrude. So if you think about a sperm, for example, or the growth cones of neurons, what they're doing is they're following chemotaxis, right? They're following gradients that are present in their environment. Chemotaxis has really grave problems. I think this sperm picture was actually taken from a paper that talked about sperm that gets stuck going in circles. It's the same kind of thing we saw in those landscapes. Chemotaxis can steer you wrong sometimes, and brain cells, oh my goodness, they're a terrible mess after all those growth cones build the initial neural reat, and it's only through really dramatic pruning subsequently of the neural network that the thing starts to function well. So chemotaxis is a way of externalizing global thinking, but again, the environment doesn't have very much to give, right? It's providing a pretty baseline sort of kind of information. So thinking locally, acting globally is hard because of this linearization problem, right? You're trying to localize, make the problem small enough that you can see so you can follow gradient descent in a useful way. It's not too hard and you don't fall into pits or go down tunnels. Another problem that can arise is what if the the global goal is just so hard to compute? It's very high dimensional. And so you get going down this hill and you have to do some kind of massive computation to determine whether or not you're actually closer to the ski lodge than you were before. So mating rituals, like, I have terrible fashion sense, as you can tell. I don't know. Was it a good idea to buy the clown Hawaiian shirt? Is that going to make my reproductive fitness better? It's a difficult calculation for me, and maybe others, are going to be better at that calculation. Certainly, the sage grouse is making some kind of calculation, or evolution has made a calculation like that for it. But it is certainly the case that many real problems are very hard to solve. So how would you solve these high-dimensional optimization problems? Well, the classic thing is keep it simple, right? So you could simplify in a number of different ways. Here's an example of dimensional reduction. So I might have a problem that gives me a picture of these two disks that are staggered near one another. If I look at them from a certain direction, they just look like two circles adjacent to one another. If I look at them from another direction, they look like two lines adjacent to each other. Both of those are wrong, right? But each might be useful. So that old axiom, all models are wrong, some are useful, comes into play in dimensional reduction. Another one is coarse graining, where we look at the world as bigger blocks and we try to not pay attention to the little underlying ones. I commend to Bob Batterman's work in this regard, a philosopher at Pitt. I think it's very interesting that we can often ignore the micro reductionist underpinnings of things in favor of their larger ones. We could adopt metacognitive tools. So you can use rules of thumb, you can use intuition or common sense that help you strip the world down to something more tractable. As you know, I think many of you know, AI is quite taken right now with trying to imbue intuition or common sense into machines. And there are several really prominent undertakings in that area. Or you could argue that I'm just mistaken. In fact, you could say There has been no better computer ever assembled that we know of in this universe than the one between your ears. And it exists to do nothing but create a model of the universe and make its model and the universe match. So Friston's free energy, now again, I probably don't understand it. It's hard, I think, for everyone, but if Carl wants to give me a call and explain why I'm completely off here, I'd be more than happy to take the call. But as I understand it, the argument is that you can, in fact, encompass a very rich pattern in your own mind and then compare it constantly with the world around you. We certainly get a lot out of goals. Are there other things we could use that would augment that or provide nuance? Could you build an entire cognitive structure thinking about tendencies or motivations, predilections, predispositions, intentions, if you want to really dive into the philosophy? Obviously, that's tricky, right? It's calculation gets much more muddy. But I think these are interesting words, and as a bumbler through the world, I think that that's the way my self works. I acknowledge that I have immediate goals. I can pick up my glass, or I can make this lecture. I also acknowledge that I'm a poor hedonic predictor, like all of us are. I have no idea what'll make me happy. I mean, I try, but as with everyone, I think every human, we're very bad at that. So what do I think is actually going on? I think we probably have motivations. I think we have some goals, but I know we're embodied. I know we're subject to satiation and certainly distraction squirrel, right? Um, those things all play into our ongoing relationship with the situations we face in the world. So you put those in an organism, and then you allow evolutionary time to bake organisms until finally you get to something that coheres as cognition, and then we've sliced it into academic disciplines. So I think goal talk to me is a useful artifact of the process that we go through to try to understand our way through the world, our bumbling through the world. Um, that's what I got, and I'm really looking forward to talking more in person in July. Oh, sorry, one quick thing. I would like to acknowledge the organizers who have done just a phenomenal job in this, the fourth year of the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute, Erica Cartmill and Jacob Foster. I'd like to also thank the Templeton World Charity Foundation for its very generous support of this undertaking. It now stands at over $30 million, so that's an amazing investment, and we should all be very grateful and also appreciate what an immense responsibility that gives all of us. And I want to thank the folks at Now You Know Media who've done a great job with the editing of this. If you saw what I'm looking at now, you'd know how good a job they're doing. So I really appreciate the effort and time that they're all putting in on our behalf. So thanks again, and look forward to talking to you in July.